Laughter rippled through the jazz music, sharp as a velvet-wrapped blade. A short, scornful remark sliced through the grandeur of San Francisco's most exclusive financial gala. "Hey, sweetheart, the service area's over there." It wasn't a joke. It was a bullet, and for a heartbeat, the entire ballroom froze. Beneath the glittering chandeliers of the Grand Meridian Hotel, everything wine glasses, music carefully rehearsed, smiles suddenly felt hollow, unbearably heavy with pretense. Avery Brooks stood at the center of the room, her tailored white suit catching the light like glass. She didn't move, didn't flinch, just stood still. Eyes forward, spine straight, breathing calm as still water before a storm. In front of her, Edward Whittaker, the third son of the chairman of Whittaker Capital, smiled with smug contempt, drunk on inherited power rather than anything earned. Beside him, his sister Victoria gave a thin laugh, her voice cutting like glass. Who does she think she is wearing white to a finance gala? A lost catering staffer. Laughter followed brittle and empty. No one intervened. No one dared. Because they all knew exactly who they were laughing with. Avery said nothing. She looked down at the glass of water in her hand, touched its rim lightly, and answered in a low, steady voice, almost a whisper. "I'm standing exactly where I belong." The calmness in her tone unsettled them more than any outburst could have. It wasn't defiance, it was a warning, wrapped in silence. At the edge of the room, a young waiter named Noah Reed stood frozen, barely past 20. He recognized that tone, the quiet strength of someone long accustomed to being dismissed, but never defeated. To him, she wasn't like anyone else in that room. There was something different, something in the stillness of a person who had already weathered storms. The violin started again, but its melody no longer fit the mood. Edward tilted his glass, taking a slow sip as his smirk deepened. "That suit looks borrowed. You sure you're not supposed to be serving over there?" The mockery drifted through the air, leaving a strange vacuum behind. Half the crowd smiled nervously, the other half avoided eye contact. Avery simply adjusted her sleeve with a clean, precise motion, then slipped a hand into her pocket. Her phone glimmered gold under the crystal light. On the screen appeared a short line of text, Protocol Atlas, standby. One subtle motion unnoticed by all except Noah, who was standing near a column with a tray of wine glasses. He caught the brief flash in her eyes, not anger, but absolute control. The air thickened. Sound seemed to fade. Every breath felt heavier. At a nearby table, a woman whispered, "Who is she? And why does she dare to stand there?" No one answered. Only Edward's laugh echoed again, louder now, forced, the sound of a man trying to prove he was still in charge. Avery began to walk. Her heels clicked against the marble floor in cold, deliberate rhythm, like the ticking of a clock. But instead of heading toward the service area, she walked straight to the central table, where the $500 million contract between Northbridge Global and Whittaker Capital Partners rested in a sleek black leather folder. Every gaze in the ballroom followed her. Victoria leaned toward her brother and whispered, "What is she doing?" Avery stopped, set her glass down, and looked into the polished metal plate engraved with the Whittaker logo. In it, she saw her own reflection, eyes no longer angry, only steady belonging to someone fully aware of the power she held. In her earpiece, her assistant, Lena Ortiz, spoke softly. "Ma'am, the organizers are asking if you plan to sign the contract tonight," Avery replied, voice smooth as wind brushing past crystal. Not anymore. Just 3 words, but they tightened Lena's chest. She knew exactly what they meant. From across the room, Richard Whittaker, father of Edward and Victoria, approached his stride, confident that of a man used to deference. He smiled, placed a hand on his son's shoulder, then turned to Avery with a tone warm, yet steeped in hierarchy. "I hope my children haven't bothered you, Miss Brooks," she said, meeting his gaze squarely. Richard's brow lifted. "Our catering department, then?" A few scattered laughs rippled through the crowd. Avery inclined her head, slightly polite as ritual. "No finance." The answer dropped like a steel bead on marble, small but echoing far. Noah swallowed hard. It felt as if he had just witnessed an earthquake happen in silence. Richard kept smiling, though his eyes dimmed slightly. He was about to speak again when Lena's voice returned through the earpiece. Internal message reporters are asking when to announce the deal. Avery didn't respond. Her gaze fell on the leather folder, and she murmured almost to herself. "That's enough." The music stopped. A sudden silence fell heavy as a curtain. Everyone froze. Avery smoothed her jacket, the white fabric gleaming beneath the chandeliers, pure, unblemished, about to witness the first stain of the night one that would shake the entire city. She turned her eyes, sweeping across Edward and Victoria, faces youthful yet hollowed by privilege, then across the glittering hall filled with people who all knew something wrong had happened, but stayed silent. Inside her there was no rage, only a cold, crystalline conviction. Dignity isn't something others grant you. It's what you hold on to when the world forgets it. A breath, a pause, and Avery smiled, a faint, almost invisible smile. And that was how the night began. Not the night of the gala, but the night the Whittaker empire began to crumble, brought down by a woman who didn't shout, didn't cry, just stood still at the perfect moment. The sound inside the ballroom felt strangled. The jazz music died mid-note, leaving a stillness as calm and tense as a lake before the storm. The chandeliers still gleamed, but their light no longer felt warm. It was cold, like the glint of steel. Avery Brooks stood there still at the center of the room, her back straight, her head high. In her eyes, the humiliation that had just happened wasn't an attack. It was a signal, the start of something. Her right hand remained in her pocket. The phone screen lit up again, showing a single line of text protocol Atlas activated. One motion, one decision, and the entire financial network behind her began to move in silence. Numbers, data clauses, and cash flows worth $500 million awaiting her next command. Across the room, Edward Whittaker was still sipping his wine with arrogant ease. He didn't realize that the silence had shifted. Whispers began to stir around him. Who is she? She's not staff. Look at her. The way she stands, it's like she's the one in charge. But Edward didn't hear them, or perhaps he chose not to. He raised his glass, his voice, loud enough for everyone to hear. I believe this VIP table is reserved for real partners, not for guests who seem a bit confused. The laughter that followed was mechanical, ritualistic. People laughed not because it was funny, but because they didn't want to stand on the wrong side. Avery stepped forward, each heel striking the marble like a hammer on stone, every sound sharp and deliberate, pulling the crowd into her rhythm. She stopped at the central table, where the $500 million contract rested in a black leather folder, the Whittaker logo embossed in gold, glinting beneath the chandelier. A deal that had been in the making for 6 months, just one signature away from completion. Avery touched the edge of the folder, not opening it, just enough to leave a faint fingerprint. An act small in motion, but heavy in meaning, a quiet declaration that said, "This belongs to me not them. In her earpiece, Lena Ortiz's voice came through quick but composed. "Legal team is ready, ma'am. Awaiting your confirmation." Avery didn't look at her phone. She simply replied, "Wait." She lifted her gaze. In front of her were faces straining to maintain courtesy over irritation. Victoria Whittaker, the younger sister, crossed her legs and spoke softly, but with a sharpened edge. "Impressive, really. I didn't think someone like you would even know how to get it in here." Avery turned her head, her eyes gleaming with a cold light. Not anger, but the razor awareness of someone who knew she held the knife. "I didn't find my way in," she said evenly. "I was invited." Victoria's lips curled, by whom Avery's answer came slow, deliberate, every syllable a scalpel. "By the contract you're trying so hard to protect." The air thickened. The meaning didn't need explaining, it carried its own gravity. Richard Whittaker, the father, stepped forward, his voice deep and diplomatic. "Miss Brooks, I believe this is a misunderstanding. Let's not let small things spoil an otherwise memorable evening." Avery tilted her head slightly, her smile polite, but her eyes unflinching. "Mr. Whittaker, sometimes it's the small things that reveal what a night is truly made of." The silence that followed was so complete, one could hear the ice melting in a glass of whiskey. Then Edward, smirking again, raised his wine glass. "Well then, allow me to toast to the true nature of this evening." He tilted his wrist, and the dark red liquid poured directly over Avery's pristine white sleeve. A slow motion spill. A collective gasp swept across the room. Someone whispered, "Oh my God." Avery looked down at the spreading stain, but didn't speak, didn't step back. She let it soak. Then she set her water glass down, gently, so softly it made no sound. Her voice cut through the tension, calm but sharp as a blade. "You just spilled $500 million on that fabric." The entire room froze. Edward blinked, giving a short, mocking laugh. "I'm sorry I don't follow." "You will," Avery interrupted, her tone, lower now, firm, final. She raised her phone. A faint gold flash reflected off the screen. The command was sent. At Northbridge Global Headquarters on Market Street, a security sequence came alive. Departments Finance, Legal, Public Relations all received the same notification simultaneously. Protocol Atlas, full freeze, execute immediately. Within seconds, transaction servers halted every transfer tied to code WCP 500M. Banking systems auto-issued alerts reading asset transfer, suspended compliance review in progress. Back in the ballroom, no one knew what had just happened except her. 1 second. 2. Nothing but silence. Then Lena's voice came through the earpiece again, steady but awed. "It's done. The contract's frozen. Media's already asking why." Avery nodded once. "Let them post. Let them tell the story themselves." Her gaze met Edward's, piercing through the arrogance that had hidden behind entitlement for far too long. He forced a laugh, trying to recover control. "You're quite dramatic, Miss Brooks. But I'm afraid." She interrupted again, her voice still calm. "You should call your father. Or your bank." A cold current shot up Edward's spine. Right then, Richard Whittaker's phone began to vibrate. He glanced down to see a flood of notifications transfer suspended. Account flagged for compliance review. His face drained of color. A ripple of whispers spread across the ballroom like fire through silk. "Something's happening. Whittaker Capital's accounts are frozen." Avery turned to the crowd, her tone even but resonant. "Ladies and gentlemen, sometimes justice doesn't need a microphone. It only needs someone willing to press send." The line sent chills down Noah's back, the young waiter still standing by the pillar. He knew he was witnessing something far beyond a party, a truth unveiled through silence. Victoria rose from her chair, her hands trembling slightly as she forced a laugh. "You're joking, right? Northbridge wouldn't dare." "Northbridge," Avery replied. "Cutting her off doesn't threaten. We act." She lifted her glass of water slightly, as if to offer a toast. To truth. To dignity. Then she took a sip. Her eyes locked on the Whitakers, who still hadn't realized their empire had just fallen. Not with an explosion, but with a silent touch. From the corner of the room, Noah watched her, his heart pounding. He couldn't look away from the woman who had just made an empire bow without raising her voice. A soft melody began again, hollow and misplaced, no one listening. Avery turned the crystal light, catching the red wine stain on her sleeve, turning what was meant as a mark of shame into a badge of honor. She walked slowly, each step measured each one, carrying weight. And somewhere in that golden fractured light, between the broken whispers and the uneasy breaths, an empire began to crack inch by inch, minute by minute, under the gaze of a woman who had already moved beyond it. Lena Avery said quietly into her earpiece, "Confirm, suspend all Whitaker transactions." "Phase 2, prepare the press release," confirmed Ma'am Lena replied. Avery stopped at the tall glass doors overlooking the city of San Francisco below. The glow of the financial district shimmered across her eyes, cold, steady, and silent. Sometimes she whispered, "Silence is the loudest strike." The first sound that echoed wasn't music. It was the vibration of dozens of phones going off at once, a small sound that struck like thunder across the crystal ballroom. On Richard Whitaker's screen, the words appeared clearly. "Transfer failed, compliance. Hold activated." He blinked once, twice, unable to process it, his throat dry as if filled with ash. Beside him, Edward pulled his phone from his suit pocket, and his screen displayed the same message transaction, cancelled authorization revoked. Suddenly, the light in the ballroom seemed dimmer, as though even the chandeliers understood that power had just changed hands. Avery stood still, no smile, no arrogance, just quiet composure, as she watched their empire begin to unravel, layer by layer, detail by detail. In her earpiece, Lena Ortiz's voice came steady and clear. "Report Whitaker accounts are now locked. Legal has confirmed the transaction suspension. Public reaction within 90 seconds. Avery nodded slightly. "Thank you, Lena. Let them discover it themselves." Across the room, Victoria pulled out her phone, her face shifting from confusion to panic. "Dad, the banking system isn't responding. Internal shares are freezing. The whispers spread like smoke. What's happening? They say Whitaker's accounts are being shut down. That can't be." The same people who laughed moments ago now whispered nervously, avoiding the center of the room. Avery took one step, only one, yet the whole room seemed to retreat. Edward tried to steady his voice, but it trembled in his throat. "You think you can destroy an empire with just one touch?" Avery tilted her head, her gaze cold as forged steel. "I didn't destroy it. I just removed the mask you stitched together with arrogance." Every word she spoke cut through the air like a blade. In the corner, Noah, the young waiter, still stood, frozen, his hands shaking over the tray. He didn't understand finance, but he could feel the weight pressing on the room, the silent collapse of a dynasty under golden light. For a few seconds, only breathing could be heard. Then Richard stepped forward, his voice trembling beneath forced calm. "Miss Brooks, I'm sure this is a misunderstanding. Let's talk like civilized people. We can fix—" "You can't fix what you chose to break," Avery interrupted. This contract was never just about numbers. It was a promise of respect. And that promise you tore apart. Richard opened his mouth, but no words came out. Avery turned toward Edward, a faint smile touching her lips. The kind of smile from someone who just finished a long chess match while her opponent still thought the game was ongoing. You want to know the difference between power and true worth, power shouts. True worth simply stands still. A sharp crack echoed the sound of glass shattering. Victoria had dropped her wine-glass red wine, spreading across the marble floor like an open wound. Avery didn't glance down. She lifted her phone and pressed a button. Lena, proceed to phase 2. Understood. Protocol Atlas full termination. At the 48th floor of Northbridge Global Headquarters, servers lit up with strings of automated commands. Artificial intelligence confirmed contract termination and triggered a cascade of pre-written press releases. Within 60 seconds, the LED screens around the ballroom, once showing a slideshow celebrating the partnership, flickered and changed. A single headline appeared in bold white letters against a black background: Northbridge Global terminates $500 million deal with Whitaker Capital, effective immediately. The ballroom erupted in gasps and murmurs. Camera flashes burst. Someone shouted, "Oh my God, is that real?" Richard stumbled back, his face pale. Victoria covered her mouth, disbelief etched in her eyes. Edward stood frozen, stiff as stone. Avery said nothing. She simply looked up at the glowing screen where her own name appeared beside her title: Avery Brooks, Founder and Chief Executive Officer, Northbridge Global Holdings. In that instant, the entire room went still. No more music, no laughter, just realization. Noah glanced around and whispered, "They mocked the woman who owns this event." A woman nearby answered softly, "No, they mocked the one who runs the empire that feeds them." Bathed in the white glare of the screen, Avery turned to face Richard. He was trembling, his voice cracking. "You can't do this in front of the public." "The public," she said evenly, "is where you chose to humiliate me. And the public is where you'll relearn what the word respect means." She looked around the room, at faces once smug, now lowered at smiles, once cruel, now gone. She lifted her glass of water, raising it to eye level, her voice low but steady. "To truth, and to justice, which doesn't need to shout, only to show proof." She set the glass down, gently. The soft clink sounded like a closing bell, marking the end of an era. Edward's phone rang, and on the screen flashed urgent credit lines suspended. He looked at his father, voice breaking. "They've frozen everything, Dad, all of it." Richard collapsed into a chair, sweat collecting at his temples. Never in his life had power felt this fragile. Avery stood unmoving, the crystal light glinting off her white suit, now stained with red wine, no longer a blemish, but a silent emblem of resistance. No one dared to speak, until Victoria finally broke the silence. "You'll regret this." Avery turned her voice so calm it almost sounded gentle. "No, but you will every time you see this red stain." She pointed to her sleeve, then walked away, moving slowly through the rows of stunned guests. With each step, she took the crowd parted instinctively like water before a steel ship. As she passed Noah, he bowed his head slightly, trembling with respect. She spoke only one sentence without turning back. "Keep your dignity, even if you're the last one who does." The glass doors opened. The cold San Francisco night swept in, carrying the damp scent of fog and salt from the bay. Inside, the chandeliers still glowed, but their light now felt bare, exposing every bowed head, every trembling hand, and the ashes of a contract burned silently into memory. Outside, Avery Brooks walked away, her figure straight beneath the city's golden lights. On the LED screen behind her, the words remained shining bright. Respect is not a courtesy. It's a contract. And in that moment, San Francisco witnessed a truth that would echo for years. Some battles need no weapons, only a person brave enough to speak through silence. The glass doors of the Grand Meridian Ballroom closed behind Avery Brooks, leaving inside not a storm of sound, but one of suffocating silence. No one knew what to say. No one dared to move. Only the vibration of phones broke the stillness, short, rapid, relentless, like the heartbeat of a dying empire. On the massive screen, Northbridge Global's announcement continued to play. Each line of white text glowed cold and sharp, like a verdict carved in glass. The $500 million contract between Northbridge Global and Whitaker Capital Partners has been officially terminated, effective immediately. The blue light from the screen washed over pale faces. Edward Whitaker was the first to shatter the paralysis. He slammed his glass against the table, his voice breaking. "She can't do this. This was our event, our contract." No one replied. He turned toward Richard Whitaker, his father, who sat motionless, his hand gripping a water glass, as if holding on to the last piece of power he had left. "Dad, say something. Call the bank, the advisors, the press." "Be quiet," Richard rasped. "Everything's frozen. The accounts, the credit lines, even the trust shares. We just lost everything." The words dropped heavy as stone, and Edward stumbled back, his face drained of color. The air thickened every breath, suddenly costly. In the corner, Victoria Whitaker stood, still staring at the screen, where Avery's face appeared from an old Forbes cover, cool, composed, unsmiling. Beneath it a quote read, "Power isn't about volume. It's about verification," Victoria whispered under her breath. She planned this from the start. Nearby, Noah Reed, the young waiter, still stood frozen. He looked around and saw the same people who once laughed, now lowering their heads, those who once declared others didn't belong, now realizing they no longer knew where they stood. A journalist invited to cover the contract signing quietly pulled out her phone and began recording. Her lens captured the wreckage, broken glass, red-stained fabric, and dozens of frozen faces. She murmured softly, as if to herself, "I just witnessed history. The Whitaker Empire collapsed in 6 minutes, and not a single person screamed." Outside the Grand Meridian, Avery walked down the glass corridor, the city lights of San Francisco reflecting across the windows, like endless streams of data. She pressed her hand to her earpiece. "Lena, I'm here, Mom. The situation's stable. Legal has confirmed contract termination. The press is reaching out non-stop. Don't respond. Let them write the story themselves." "Understood." "And are you all right?" Avery smiled faintly, her voice calm as the wind. "I'm fine. Just pitying those who thought they could put a price on respect." She stopped before a wide window overlooking the city below. Cars still moving, people, still rushing, unaware that a single silent action had just shifted the balance of an entire financial sector. Back inside the ballroom, Richard Whitaker rose, trying to regain the air of control. "Edward, contact the press. We'll issue a statement. We need to counter this before the headlines take over." With what Edward shouted. "She holds all the documents." The termination was legally executed. Richard turned sharply, his eyes blazing. "We're Whitakers, we still have our name." Victoria cut in, her voice trembling. "A name doesn't buy back money, Father." And the person who just took it from us was the same woman you called unworthy. The words sliced through the air like a second blade. In another corner, Eleanor Whittaker. Their mother was trembling as she held her phone. She tried calling her contacts in the media, but no one picked up. Each call declined, every message answered with the same cold words, "in a meeting." She lowered the phone, tears filling her eyes. We taught our children how to inherit, but never how to respect. The room fell silent once more. A second reporter approached Noah, who hadn't moved an inch. "You work here, right? What did you see happen?" Noah swallowed hard. I saw them laugh, and then she stood there, silent. But somehow, she made everyone else silent too. The journalist wrote down every word. That clip hours later would go viral under the headline, "She didn't yell." She ended them. Outside, Avery reached the main doors. A security guard stepped forward to open them for her, but she raised her hand slightly. "It's all right. I can do it myself." The doors swung open. The night wind swept in, brushing her hair, rustling the white fabric of her suit. Behind her, her shadow stretched against the marble wall, alone, yet steady, as if the entire world stood behind her. Lena's voice returned through the earpiece. "Official release is out. Every major outlet's publishing. And Mom, the hashtag Silent Power is trending to the top." Avery let out a quiet laugh, not out of pride, but release. "Silence isn't weakness, Lena. It's how justice echoes louder than noise." Meanwhile, inside the ballroom, everyone's phones buzzed at once with breaking news alerts. Northbridge CEO Avery Brooks terminates $500 million deal after public humiliation. Whittaker Capital faces liquidity crisis. Silent Power, the new movement redefining dignity and female leadership. Guests began leaving their tables, avoiding the Whittakers' eyes, as if stepping away from an open pit. Edward looked around, watching everyone pack up and walk away without a glance back. "Dad, what do we do now?" Richard lowered his head, his voice hoarse and spent. We start by learning how to respect others from the beginning." As Avery's car pulled away from the Grand Meridian, the city lights shimmered against the glass. She rolled down the window, letting the cool wind wash away the noise behind her. On the front seat, her phone buzzed with hundreds of messages: congratulations, interview requests, partnership offers. She opened none of them. Instead, she looked down at the dried red stain on her sleeve, permanent, but not unwelcome. "A stain doesn't soil a white fabric," she whispered, when it's washed in truth. Golden light drifted across her face, reflecting in eyes that held the calm of someone who had won, not through vengeance, but through justice. Far across the skyline, a massive LED billboard lit up above downtown San Francisco, displaying the words, "She didn't raise her voice. She raised the standard." Avery closed her eyes and leaned back in her seat. The city was still blazing with light, but within her there was only stillness, the quiet after a storm, and the beginning of a new chapter for justice. News traveled faster than light. Less than 1 hour after Avery Brooks walked out of the Grand Meridian Hotel, the internet erupted. On Twitter, the hashtag Silent Power climbed to the top in just 18 minutes. A 28-second video spread across every platform, showing Edward Whittaker's mocking smirk, the red wine spilling over Avery's white sleeve, and her calm voice saying, "You just poured $500 million on that fabric." Under the clip, thousands of users commented the same line, "She didn't yell. She ended them." Inside the high-rise offices of Northbridge Global Holdings, Lena Ortiz, and the communications team were monitoring the data screens. Public sentiment charts glowed bright green, over 90% positive. Major news outlets were calling non-stop. CNN, Forbes, CNBC. "Everyone wants an interview with her," one staffer exclaimed. "And Whittaker Capital?" Lena asked. "Stocks down 37% in 40 minutes. Some investors are pulling out. They're collapsing." Lena exhaled slowly. On her screen, the viral video played again, the image of Avery in her white suit, standing amid the elite like the embodiment of justice. She never had to raise her voice, Lena whispered. The world spoke for her. Across the city, in a small apartment in the Mission District, Noah Reid sat staring at his phone. The screen glowed with millions of views on the clip he'd posted to TikTok. His caption was simple: "I saw her stand still, and the world stopped with her." Comments flooded in like rain. "The strongest woman I've ever seen. She's the new definition of power. I want my daughter to see this clip." Noah clenched his hand, feeling something unfamiliar hope. He had never imagined witnessing justice delivered not through rage, but through dignity. That night, the financial towers downtown gleamed brighter than ever. But in the 60th floor, penthouse of Northbridge Avery, sat alone. Before her, the laptop screen was filled with flashing headlines. "Avery Brooks redefines corporate power. The Whittaker dynasty crumbles in silence. The most expensive glass of wine in history." She scrolled through them, eyes calm and unreadable. In her earpiece, Lena's voice came through. "Ma'am, the board wants to know if you plan to issue an official statement." Avery took a slow sip of coffee, her tone steady and low. "No need. When actions speak clearly, enough words become unnecessary." She smiled faintly, gazing out through the glass. Below, San Francisco shimmered like a living circuit board, a city known for noise, but tonight it seemed to listen to the silence of one woman. Meanwhile, inside the Whittaker estate, the crisis had reached its peak. Richard Whittaker sat in the conference room, surrounded by advisors and attorneys, their faces pale as paper. Bank accounts frozen, international branches under audit, and the media, "They're not on our side anymore," one advisor reported. Edward slammed the table, shouting all this because of one woman's pride. His mother, Eleanor Whittaker, cut in coldly. "No, Edward. Not pride, dignity. They're different things, and you've never understood the difference." The room fell silent. Victoria sat quietly in the corner, staring out toward the garden. "She didn't need to win," she murmured. "She just needed the world to see that we lost." The words made Richard close his eyes. Inside him, the pride of a dynasty that once ruled Wall Street began to crumble piece by piece. By morning, the story had covered every major outlet across America. On morning talk shows, experts debated fervently. She didn't just end a contract, she started a new era of ethical leadership. Avery Brooks has become the face of integrity in business. Online thousands shared photos of her white suit, red wine stain, calm face, captioned with one sentence: "Silence isn't weakness. Silence is strength waiting for its moment." That afternoon, Avery received a call from Noah Reid. His voice trembled. "Miss Brooks, I don't know what to say, except thank you. The clip I filmed just passed 10 million views." She laughed softly. "I should be the one thanking you. You captured the truth. I just felt like I had to do something. When they insulted you, I didn't have the courage to step in. But at least I could show the world what I saw." Avery's voice warmed, steady, and kind. "Sometimes courage isn't about shouting. It's about refusing to look away. In that moment, Noah understood she wasn't just a CEO. She was someone teaching the world how to stand tall with dignity. Late that night, Avery opened a voice memo on her phone, the one she'd recorded the night before. Her own voice played softly. Day 1. Silence executed. Impact immediate. Objective not revenge. Clarification. She smiled faintly as she listened, her tone calmer, now no longer trembling. She rose and walked onto the balcony. The night breeze swept through her hair, carrying the faint scent of salt from the bay. Below her, the North Bridge Tower glowed like a beacon, the new symbol of silent power. A message popped up from Lena. Forbes just sent an invitation for a special feature, The Woman Who Redefined Power. Would you like to accept? Avery replied. No. They'll write it themselves. I don't need to retell what they've already witnessed. At that same moment, a massive electronic billboard lit up in downtown San Francisco. Avery's image appeared in her white suit, and beneath it, Northbridge Global's new slogan glowed across the skyline, "Power doesn't shout. It stands." People on the street stopped to look. A little girl tugged her mother's hand. "Mom, who is she?" The mother smiled softly. "She's the woman who reminded the world that silence has a voice." In the night, the city lights reflected in Avery's eyes the gaze of someone who had endured judgment, been underestimated, but never lost herself. She spoke softly, as if to everyone who had ever been dismissed. You don't need to shout to be heard. You just need to stand firm and let justice speak for you. Below, San Francisco blazed with light. But among all that brilliance, one thing shone brighter than anything else: faith. The faith that when dignity is preserved, it will always outshine power. 3 days. Just 3 days, and the name Whitaker Capital, once a symbol of power that dominated Wall Street for more than half a century, had become the most tangible example of collapse in the digital age. It began with the silence of one woman, but it ended with the silence of an entire empire. On Monday morning, newspapers across the nation carried the same headlines. Whitaker Group faces full-scale financial crisis. A billion-dollar dynasty brought down by arrogance. Avery Brooks, the woman who made the market listen. The words ran across every news screen, each headline a cold blade cutting deeper into the Whitaker family's reputation. At the Whitaker headquarters in Manhattan, the grand lobby stood empty. The framed photographs that once lined the walls, Richard Whitaker shaking hands with world leaders, Edward delivering speeches at finance summits, were being taken down one frame at a time. Edward sat in the conference room, his hands clenched tightly. In front of him, 3 lawyers and 2 advisors spoke in rushed, hushed tones. All major banks have officially suspended credit lines, one reported. The Securities and Exchange Commission has opened an ethics investigation. Major shareholders are demanding withdrawal within 48 hours. Each sentence struck like a blow to the chest. Edward turned toward his father, Richard Whitaker, the man who once commanded respect across the financial world, now slumped in his chair, eyes hollow, stripped of all authority. "Dad," Edward stammered, "we can recover, right? They can't destroy us over one small mistake." Richard slowly lifted his head. "A small mistake," he said, his laugh dry and broken. "You mocked a woman standing in the same room as you. A woman who once saved this company from bankruptcy 5 years ago with her own investment fund." "You didn't know," Edward froze. "She saved us." "Yes," Richard said, his voice heavy. "And you poured wine on the person who saved you." He leaned back, closed his eyes, as if the weight of half a lifetime had come crashing down all at once. In the Whitakers' Malibu beachfront villa, Eleanor Whitaker sat alone in front of the television. The ocean wind fluttered the curtains, brushing against a family photograph on the table, Edward's Harvard graduation day. They were all smiling, then confident proud. Now that smile felt like a luxury. The reporter's voice carried through the air. Sources confirm that Whitaker Capital may file for bankruptcy protection this week. The event is being called the steepest decline in American finance this decade. Eleanor closed her eyes. The first tear fell, not for money, but for the pride they had lost. She whispered softly, "We taught our children how to win, but never how to face defeat." At Northbridge Global Headquarters, Avery Brooks entered the conference room with her usual calm. No flowers, no applause, just quiet respect. Lena Ortiz stood waiting, holding a market report. "Revenue's up 28%. Every investor wants to partner with us. But more than that, people are calling you the symbol of ethical power." Avery set down her bag and smiled faintly. "Power isn't about what we can do to others, Lena. It's about how we respond when others try to diminish us." "You didn't have to speak," Lena said. "But the world still heard you." "Because I wasn't speaking for myself," Avery replied. "I spoke for everyone who's ever been silenced." Morning sunlight streamed through the window, glinting on the faint red stain on her sleeve, a mark she had never washed away. She brushed it gently like a scar that no longer hurt, only reminded. That afternoon, Whitaker Capital held an emergency press conference. Reporters packed the hall flashes, bursting like lightning. Richard stepped up to the podium, his face drawn and pale. Beside him stood Edward and Victoria, their first public appearance since the gala. His voice was low, strained, cracking between breaths. "We acknowledge the serious failures in our conduct, not only in business decisions, but in how we treated others. We apologize." A journalist called out, "Mr. Whitaker, do you think this apology is enough to save your empire?" Richard met the camera's gaze, his eyes no longer proud, only honest. "No. But maybe it can save what's left of our conscience." The room fell silent. Cameras stopped clicking. Somewhere else in her Northbridge office, Avery watched the live broadcast quietly. She didn't smile, she didn't gloat. She simply turned to Lena and said softly, "At last they've learned the one lesson money can't buy." That evening in a small cafe in Soma, Noah Reed opened his laptop to read the latest headline. "Whitaker Capital officially declares bankruptcy." Richard Whitaker steps down as CEO. He closed the lid thoughtful and pulled from his pocket a business card. It read, "Avery Brooks, founder and Chief Executive Officer, Northbridge Global Holdings." Beneath it, "Integrity is the new currency." Noah smiled not from joy, but from understanding. Justice might move slowly, but it always arrives with precision. The next morning, a massive banner hung across the main tower of Northbridge. No photo of Avery, no flashy logo, just 6 white words against a black background. "Respect is a contract. Keep it." People stopped on the street to take pictures. Online millions shared the image, calling it the defining message of a new era. Respect once lost is a debt that can never be repaid. Late that night, Avery sat at her desk, the lamplight outlining her calm expression. On her screen were dozens of invitations from international organizations asking her to speak on ethical leadership. She closed them all. No need for a stage. Before leaving the office, she opened her voice recorder and added a new entry. Day 3. The consequences have arrived. Not as revenge, but as awakening. No one is untouchable. Every empire that forgets dignity will dissolve in silence. She saved the file, turned off the lights, and stepped onto the balcony. The ocean breeze swept through, carrying away the ashes of the past. Above, the San Francisco sky sparkled with city lights like shards of broken glass, beautiful yet fragile. Avery looked up, her smile serene. Nothing is stronger than truth, and nothing echoes farther than silence when it belongs to justice. Below, the city kept moving, traffic flowing endlessly. But somewhere within every person, a new lesson was being written. A lesson about self-respect, about the limits of power, and about the woman who reminded the world that dignity isn't something to demand. It's something to keep. The storm had passed, but the waves it left behind kept spreading from the skyscrapers of San Francisco to small offices where young people looked up at their screens and saw the image of a woman who refused to bow her head. The name Avery Brooks was no longer tied only to a financial empire. It had become a keyword for a movement. At Columbia University, a professor of business ethics played the video titled "The $500 Million Silence" for her senior students. On the screen, Avery stood in the center of the Grand Meridian Ballroom, light reflecting off the red wine stain on her sleeve, her face calm as stone. The professor spoke firmly. This wasn't just a contract cancellation. This was the first recorded instance in modern financial history of systemic moral resistance, an act that didn't destroy others but forced them to look inward. The students sat in silence. In the back row, a young black woman wrote quietly in her notebook. Dignity doesn't need a microphone. In a small cafe in Chicago, 2 young employees discussed the viral video. She didn't say a single harsh word, yet she made the entire room fall silent. I think I know that feeling when you're looked down on but can't speak up. The other smiled softly. Well, now we can. She made me believe that silence doesn't mean weakness. A photo of Avery in her white suit with that composed gaze was printed and pinned to the cafe wall beneath a handwritten line. Silence speaks. With dignity. At Northbridge Global, the office was quieter than usual, yet filled with a distinct energy, not noise but quiet pride. Lena Ortiz walked into the CEO's office. Avery was standing by the glass wall looking down at the city. Final report, ma'am. Whitaker Capital has been delisted from the exchange. And you? Another magazine? Cover Avery smiled faintly. Not just one, Lena said. Forbes Time. The Financial Review, they're calling you. The woman who ended noise. Avery shook her head. I didn't end the noise, Lena. I just taught them to hear the sound of truth again. Lena looked at her for a moment, then said, You know, everyone here says, if she could stand tall in front of power, then we can stand tall in front of injustice. That made Avery turn, her eyes softening. That's enough. I never wanted to be a symbol. I only wanted to remind people no one has the right to take another person's dignity. While Northbridge had become the new standard for ethical leadership on the other side, those who once bore the Whitaker name were still trying to find their footing. Victoria Whitaker, once the so-called Queen of High Society Investment, now worked as an independent advisor for a non-profit foundation. One day, she entered a classroom where she had been invited to lecture on business ethics. She held the microphone, her voice small but sincere. My dear students, I once thought silence was weakness, until a woman made my entire family bow their heads with that very silence. The room fell still. A student raised a hand. If you could meet her again, what would you say? Victoria smiled, her eyes carrying a quiet gratitude. I'd say thank you. Thank you for shattering our illusions without having to raise your voice. At that same moment, Noah Reed sat in a small Northbridge office wearing a crisp white shirt. On his desk was a new business card, Noah Reed Communications Associate. The door opened. Avery walked in holding a cup of coffee. Ready for your first day? Noah nodded, smiling. I still can't believe I get to be here. Avery placed a hand on his shoulder, her gaze warm, yet steady. It's not luck, Noah. It's because you looked when everyone else turned away. He nodded, speechless. In that moment, Noah understood some moments redefine who we are, and sometimes simply keeping an honest heart means choosing the right side. A month later, Avery was invited to speak at the International Conference on Corporate Integrity and Leadership Ethics in Geneva. She hadn't planned to attend, but Lena persuaded her. They don't need CEO Avery Brooks. They need the woman in the white suit with the red wine stain. Avery looked at the suit hanging in her office, the faint mark still visible, a witness to one defining night. She smiled gently. All right. But I won't talk about power. I'll talk about silence. At the Geneva Convention Hall, thousands sat in quiet anticipation as Avery took the stage. No spotlights, no music, only her, the microphone, and a voice steady as a heartbeat. I once believed silence made us weak, but that night I learned silence isn't retreat. It's the choice of those who know they don't need to shout to be heard. She paused, letting her words breathe. Sometimes the greatest power is when you don't need to prove you're stronger than anyone else, but still make the world question itself. No one clapped at first, only eyes glistening with tears. Then came the applause, soft at first, then rising wave after wave. In that moment, Avery didn't feel like a CEO, a victor, or a symbol. She was simply a person once underestimated, who chose not to fight with noise, but with truth. Later that night, back in her hotel room, her phone rang. It was Victoria Whittaker. Avery hesitated, then answered. Victoria's voice was quiet, uncertain. I just wanted to say thank you. You taught me the most expensive lesson without saying a word. Avery replied softly. We all have lessons to learn, Victoria. So do I. A brief silence followed. Then both women laughed, light as the breeze. That night, Geneva shimmered under white lights. Avery stood by the window gazing at the still waters of Lake Leman. The wind brushed through cool against her skin, yet her heart felt warm. She took out her phone and recorded a new voice note. Day 4. Justice has spread. It's no longer mine alone, but ours. When one person dares to stand still, the world learns to pause and listen. She stopped the recording, closed her eyes, and breathed deeply. Outside ripples danced across the surface of the lake, reflecting the stars above. And somewhere within those ripples, the voice of truth continued to echo, not loud, not dazzling, but steady, enduring, impossible to silence. 10 days after the speech in Geneva, the world no longer seemed the same. Not because a $500 million contract had vanished, but because the way people looked at power had changed. Everywhere from small startups to global corporations, 2 words once ignored were now on everyone's lips: ethical leadership. And at the center of that movement, the name Avery Brooks echoed not loudly, but endlessly. In Tokyo, a young CEO of a major electronics company spoke at an internal meeting. We used to believe silence was weakness. But after watching Avery Brooks's speech, I realized silence is only weak when truth isn't standing behind it. In London, a BBC journalist opened a talk show with the words, Not everyone can bring down a financial empire with a single look, but Avery Brooks did it not with power, but with principle. In New York, law students at Columbia held a symposium called The Brooks Effect, analyzing how her actions reshaped the standards of corporate fairness. While the world debated the meaning of this new Brooks Effect, Avery herself lived quietly. She avoided interviews, declined talk shows, and stayed far from publicity. Each morning she arrived at Northbridge, sat with her usual cup of coffee, and read through staff emails. She didn't see herself as a hero. She only saw one thing: her silence had become a voice for millions. One afternoon, Lena Ortiz entered her office holding a folder. "Ma'am, the United Nations sent an invitation. They want you to join their program on corporate human rights." Avery looked up, her eyes calm but tired. "I'm not an activist, Lena." "Maybe not," Lena said, "but you're the reason activists are finally being heard. You opened a door we only knew how to knock on." Avery was silent. In her mind, the image of that gala night returned: the crystal lights, the hollow laughter, the spill of red wine, and that one still moment when an entire room stopped before a woman's calm. She exhaled slowly. "All right. If they want to listen, I'll speak not about me, but about change." Across the Atlantic, another woman was changing too: Victoria Whitaker. After the Geneva conference, she left New York and joined a non-profit organization in Denver. On her first day, she was assigned to lead a program supporting young female entrepreneurs. That evening, she wrote an article for a business magazine. "We once believed strength was the ability to make others fear us. But I've learned that true strength is when you make others believe in something better." The article went viral. At the end, Victoria added a single line of gratitude. "Thank you to the one who taught me that sometimes the greatest thing we can do is stay silent long enough to listen." Meanwhile, at Northbridge, Noah Reed, now a full-time employee, was compiling reports about the global spread of the Brooks Effect. He read headlines: "Brazilian CEO resigns after discrimination scandal." "Korean conglomerate introduces zero disrespect policy." "Quiet but unstoppable. The Brooks Effect continues to ripple." Noah smiled, remembering that night at the gala, the look in Avery's eyes, the silence, heavy as gravity. He thought maybe she didn't just save herself. Maybe she saved how people treat one another. That afternoon, Avery had an unexpected encounter. As she stepped out of the building, a middle-aged woman approached her. It was Eleanor Whitaker. Dressed simply, her face weary, but her eyes sincere. "Miss Brooks," she said softly, "I didn't come to justify anything. I just came to say thank you." Avery looked at the woman before her, once proud and distant, now trembling slightly as she spoke. "Thank you for not seeking revenge. Thank you for giving us the chance to see ourselves clearly." Avery smiled gently. "I never needed them to regret Mrs. Whitaker. I just needed the world to know that dignity, even when trampled, can still rise again." Eleanor nodded, eyes glistening. Before leaving, she turned and said, "If there's a next life, I hope my son learns from you." Avery didn't respond. She simply bowed her head, her heart light as release. That night back in her apartment, she opened her familiar voice recorder. Her voice filled the quiet, low and steady. Day 5. Echoes from silence. When justice stops being news and becomes a habit. When people begin to correct themselves, not out of fear, but out of understanding. She paused, then continued. "I realize now my purpose was never to destroy anyone. It was to plant a seed and let the world nurture it to life." She turned off the recorder and looked out the window. The city was still glowing, but the light felt different tonight, warmer, truer. 3 weeks later, Avery arrived at the United Nations headquarters in New York. As she entered the grand hall, hundreds rose to applaud. On the stage, the blue laurel emblem of the world reflected in her eyes. Avery began, "I'm not here as a CEO, but as someone who was once forced into silence. And I chose to remain silent, not in surrender, but to give justice the time it needed to find its voice." The audience held its breath. If power ever makes us forget respect, then respect itself will reclaim that power in the quietest yet deepest way. Her tone was not loud or fast, but every word carried the weight of lived truth. When she finished, the entire hall stood. Applause filled the air, not wild, not deafening, but steady, reverent, a recognition expressed through silence. That night, Avery left the United Nations and walked along the park by the Hudson River. The breeze was soft, the ripples on the water gentle whispering. On her phone screen, thousands of messages poured in thank yous from women employees and people once overlooked. She didn't reply to any of them. She simply lifted her gaze to the night sky, where faint stars blended like a quiet symphony. The world won't change in a day, she thought. But if even one person dares to stand still, the entire system can learn to pause. A single raindrop fell light pure. Avery looked up and smiled. Beneath the night sky, silence spoke once more, not as an ending, but as a beginning. 1 year after that fateful night at the Grand Meridian, the world had forgotten many things. The deals, the rumors, the headlines. But it had not forgotten the silence of Avery Brooks. The sensational titles were gone. The hashtags had faded. What remained were quiet, lasting changes, like wind smoothing stone like waves, silently reshaping the shore. At universities around the world, the Brooks case had become a classic lesson in business ethics. Students read, debated, and then fell silent as they watched the footage of her standing in the ballroom, not shouting, not reacting, just holding her ground. The professor said, "That is how true justice works. It doesn't need noise, only steadfastness." At Northbridge Global Avery's office now displayed a framed piece, not an award or a title, but the white suit jacket, still marked with a faint red wine stain. Beneath it, a small engraving read, "Power doesn't shout. It remembers." Every employee who walked past paused for a moment, reminded that in every contract, in every number, there must always be room for human dignity. As for Avery, she lived more slowly now. She declined awards, stepped down from her executive role, and founded the Dignity Foundation, a global initiative dedicated to teaching ethical leadership to young women. She no longer sought to build an empire, but to build a path, so others wouldn't have to fight the same battles she once did. One autumn afternoon, Avery returned to the Grand Meridian. The ballroom where it had all begun had been transformed into a community hall. The golden light streamed down, glinting off memories that still lingered in the air. She stood in the center of the hall, the same spot where people once mocked her. Now it was the stage for the graduation ceremony of the Women in Leadership program she had created. Hundreds of young women stood in white suits, their eyes bright with purpose. As Avery stepped onto the stage, no one cheered. They simply stood together in silence. She smiled, her voice soft as a breath. "Thank you. Don't remember me as someone who won. Remember me as someone who chose to stand still when everything around her trembled. And if one day the world tries to silence you, let that silence become the voice of your courage." The entire room fell quiet, not with fear, but with reverence. As Avery left the hall, the sunset painted the sky crimson. The light touched her sleeve, where the old wine stain remained faded, but not gone. It was no longer a blemish. It was a testament that once a woman had been dismissed, yet through composure and dignity, she had rewritten the meaning of power. And in that moment, Avery understood silence does not end a story. It begins a new culture, one where respect is not an option, but the standard. 10 years had passed since that gala night. The world had changed faster, louder, more restless. Yet among the millions of voices debating and shouting, people still spoke of the woman who once made a room full of power fall silent with nothing more than a look. Her name, Avery Brooks, was no longer just a person's name. It had become a concept, the Brooks effect, leadership driven by ethics, not intimidation. Avery's home sat on a hillside overlooking the Pacific Ocean. In the morning, sunlight spilled across her desk, where only one object remained, a small, worn voice recorder, the same one she had used to capture the days of her journey. Now it held only one final recording. Avery pressed play, and her voice filled the quiet, low, steady, and serene. Final daylight. I have walked through many rooms, under many lights, through countless handshakes. But what I carry with me is not contracts. It's the eyes that have learned how to look at each other as equals. Her tone softened as she continued. If anyone asks me what power is, I would say this power isn't found in the voice that makes others afraid, but in the calm that makes them think. Truth doesn't need applause. It only needs to be lived honestly. She paused, and her next words came gently, like a farewell whispered to time itself. I leave behind no fortune, only faith that every person will face a moment where they must choose to stay silent out of fear or to stay silent for change. She stopped the recorder. A moment of perfect stillness followed. Outside, the waves kept their rhythm. A seabird glided through the sunlight, its wings casting silver patterns across the glass. Avery closed her eyes, a faint smile on her lips, peaceful, as though she had completed a long symphony without missing a single note. In the heart of the city, the lights of the Dignity Foundation still glowed. Hundreds of students gathered for the annual scholarship ceremony held in her name. On the large screen, words appeared in memory of Avery Brooks. She never shouted. She never bowed. She taught the world to stand. As night descended, the ocean reflected the moonlight. There were no more words, only the light of silence. The same light first kindled by a red wine stain, now spreading across the world as a quiet message. Respect is not given. It's lived. And somewhere within the wind, it was as if Avery's voice whispered, "Justice never dies. It only waits for someone calm enough to keep it alive." The light stretched far across the sea. The story came to a close, not with an ending, but with the continuation of faith. From the perspective of an expert in leadership ethics and corporate culture, the story of Avery Brooks is not just the triumph of an individual, but a testament to the strength of composure in a noisy world. She taught us that silence is not weakness, but the highest form of strength when you are powerful enough not to prove anything, and steady enough to let truth speak for itself. In a world where power is often measured by volume, Avery reminds us that dignity is the most powerful language of all. If you believe that justice doesn't need to shout to be heard, hit like to spread this message. Subscribe to follow more journeys where people learn to stand tall amidst power and prejudice, and leave a comment with the words that reflect your belief. Hold your dignity.